Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes and launched one of history's most devastating expansions. Within decades, Mongol armies ruled land from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, forming the largest contiguous empire ever. Their success was not built on weapons alone. Beyond speed and tactics, the Mongols mastered fear, understanding that terror travels faster than armies and can force surrender without a fight. Fear is strategy, not excess. Medieval warfare was brutal everywhere. Cities were sacked, civilians killed, and captives abused by nearly all armies of the age. What distinguished the Mongols was not cruelty alone, but consistency. Violence under Mongol rule was rarely random. It followed patterns that observers across China, Persia, Russia, and Europe described with chilling similarity. The Mongols practiced what modern historians call demonstration violence. Cities that resisted fiercely were punished so severely that neighboring cities would surrender without resistance. Those who submitted early might be spared destruction, reinforcing the logic that obedience meant survival. Over time, Mongol terror became self-propagating. Towns capitulated not because they were weak, but because resistance no longer seemed rational. Law, discipline, and the yasa. Contrary to the image of a lawless horde, Mongol violence was anchored in a rigid system of discipline and custom commonly referred to as the yasa, a body of laws and decrees attributed to Genghis Khan. Whether fully codified or transmitted through tradition, the yasa governed military behavior, loyalty, punishment, and social order. It enforced absolute obedience through collective responsibility and severe penalties. Mongol armies were organized in a decimal system, binding soldiers into units where individual failure endangered everyone. Desertion, theft, or disobedience could result in collective punishment, creating an environment where fear flowed not only from commanders downward, but horizontally through the ranks. This internal terror produced extraordinary cohesion. Mongol armies did not rely on morale or ideology, they relied on certainty. Diplomacy as a tripwire. Mongol diplomacy was uncompromising. Envoys were not negotiators in the modern sense, but instruments of imperial authority. To harm them was to invite annihilation. The infamous incident at Otrar, involving the Khwarezmian governor Inalchuk and Mongol envoys, became foundational to Mongol terror lore. The punishment inflicted on those deemed responsible entered historical memory as a warning that violations of Mongol diplomatic norms would be answered with disproportionate violence. Whether every gruesome detail recorded by later chroniclers is literal or symbolic, the message was unmistakable. The Mongols framed their wars not as arbitrary conquest, but as justified retribution against those who violated order. Cities as warnings. The destruction of cities such as Merv and Nishapur in the early 13th century became defining moments in the Mongol conquest and permanently shaped their reputation across Eurasia. Contemporary chroniclers describe slaughter on a scale so vast that even medieval writers, accustomed to violence, struggled to comprehend it. Population figures recorded in the sources often reach staggering numbers, leading modern historians to caution that exact totals were likely exaggerated. Yet behind the inflated arithmetic lies a grim consensus: these cities suffered near total devastation, their populations shattered, and their urban life erased almost overnight. What mattered most to Mongol strategy was not numerical accuracy, but psychological reach. The fall of Merv did not remain a local tragedy. Refugees fled in every direction. Merchants carried tales along trade routes, and survivors spoke with the authority of first-hand witness. Each retelling amplified the horror, embedding it into collective memory. As news spread, resistance elsewhere collapsed without Mongol armies ever appearing at the gates. Cities surrendered not because they had been defeated, but because they had learned what defiance meant. Memory itself became a weapon, crushing authority in the West. When Mongol forces moved into the lands of the Rusas, the pattern repeated. Terror arrived before conquest, undermining resistance before battles were even fought. After the Battle of the Khalkha River, the fate of captured princes entered European historical consciousness as something uniquely degrading. Accounts of nobles suffocated beneath wooden platforms while Mongol commanders feasted above them circulated widely, leaving a deep impression on medieval writers. These executions were not acts of spontaneous cruelty. They were deliberately staged. Mongol strategy targeted the foundations of political authority, aiming to destroy not only armies, but the belief that rulers could protect their people. By reducing princes and nobles to helpless objects in public spectacles, the Mongols dismantled the social contract between leaders and followers. Authority itself was humiliated, displayed as powerless before Mongol dominance. Baghdad and cultural shock. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 stands as one of the most traumatic episodes of medieval history. As the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate and a global center of learning, administration, and culture, Baghdad symbolized centuries of intellectual achievement. Its destruction sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and beyond, marking not just the loss of a city, but the collapse of an era. Chroniclers described libraries destroyed, scholars killed, and manuscripts discarded into the Tigris River. Whether every detail is literal or partly symbolic, the imagery conveys a deeper reality. Mongol terror targeted meaning as much as people. By annihilating institutions of knowledge, faith, and governance, the Mongols demonstrated that cultural prestige offered no protection. Civilization itself could be erased if it stood in the path of conquest. Survivors and trade routes. The effectiveness of Mongol terror depended heavily on communication. Eurasia's interconnected trade networks, particularly the Silk Road, allowed stories to travel almost as fast as armies. Merchants carried not only goods, but news. Refugees carried trauma that gave their words emotional force and credibility. Survivors of massacres became living evidence of what resistance invited. In some cases, Mongol forces deliberately allowed survivors to escape. These individuals spread fear more effectively than threats or proclamations ever could. The Mongols needed no centralized propaganda. Terror marketed itself. Cities surrendered because evidence of resistance was visible, emotional, and repeated across regions. By the time Mongol banners appeared, the psychological battle was often already decided. Conditional violence and calculated mercy. One of the most unsettling aspects of Mongol rule was its conditional nature. The same empire capable of annihilating entire cities could also protect merchants, secure trade routes, and employ administrators from conquered populations. This contrast sharpened fear rather than softening it. Survival under Mongol rule was possible, but only through absolute submission. The uncertainty was itself a weapon. Mercy existed, but it was unpredictable and selectively applied. Communities never knew whether obedience would bring safety or delayed destruction. This instability discouraged rebellion more effectively than constant brutality. The possibility of mercy kept populations compliant, while the memory of annihilation ensured they did not test its limits. Myth, memory, and historical caution. Over centuries, Mongol terror accumulated legends. Some accounts, such as claims of biological warfare during the Siege of Kaffa, remain debated among historians. Later successor states, especially the Golden Horde, are often retroactively blended into narratives about Genghis Khan himself. As a result, the historical picture can blur into a single monolithic image of Mongol violence. Recognizing exaggeration does not weaken the historical reality. It clarifies it. The Mongols did not need invention or myth to inspire fear. Enough real devastation occurred that exaggeration became believable. Legend grew because it was rooted in genuine catastrophe, reinforced by consistent patterns of destruction across vast territories. The long shadow of Mongol terror. The Mongol Empire fragmented within a few generations, but its psychological imprint endured for centuries. In Russia, memories of Mongol domination shaped political culture and attitudes towards centralized authority. In China, the trauma influenced military architecture and defensive planning. In the Islamic world, the sack of Baghdad symbolized a rupture from which many believed civilization never fully recovered. The Mongols demonstrated that terror, when organized and systematized, could function as statecraft. Their empire offers an uncomfortable historical truth. Fear works, at least in the short term. It can collapse resistance, control populations, and reshape entire regions without constant warfare. Though the empire vanished, the shadow it cast over human memory remains, a reminder of how deeply fear can carve itself into history. If you found this deep dive into history's darkest strategies insightful and thought-provoking, there are many more stories like this waiting to be uncovered. If you want to be smarter every day, like and subscribe.